So you already know, right? But do you actually do? Because the difference between the people that are seriously good is that they actually have a really minimal margin between knowing what they know and doing what they do. And those that are kind of amateurs are in a position that they already know, but they don't do. And this is that whole basic idea. You know you're supposed to eat well, but do you? You know you're supposed to exercise, but do you? You know that you're supposed to do a whole range of things, but do you? Now let's have a quick look at that, because inside of business today, we train a whole heap of scripts and dialogues, but what we don't really think about is about really understanding, do people in our teams really understand what to do next? Now let's have a little bit of a think about what is a really important conversation. You go out there today and you go and do a market appraisal on someone's house. And you go and do that market appraisal, and whilst you're there at the appraisal, the seller says, hey, you know what, I'm not going to sell, I just want to know what the value of my place is. And you kind of take that, and you're like, oh, okay, cool. And so you finish the market appraisal, then what happens? Well, most real estate agents in Australia would probably get themselves in a position that they would go and maybe write a letter of appraised value, right? They send that to the client in email, maybe even in paper form, whatever. And then like literally maybe then what happens? I don't know, maybe we might call them a week later and say, hey, are you going to sell? You're not. Okay, well, have a nice life. And the interesting conversation is that there's nothing else that actually happens. What we actually got to have a look at in really designing experiences is we actually like to start to think, how do we actually take what the best agents do and create it so it's in such a simple, easy system that even someone who's brand new to the team knows what to do next without having to have the 20 to 30 years worth of experience. And the lesson to that is imagine if you just had a great market appraisal follow-up menu. So like literally like a restaurant, just a menu, oh, here's the things I could do now that I'm walking out of that meeting. And these are some of the things that you could do. Number one, you could go and add them to your database in the market appraisal category. Makes sense, right? Because then you can bring them up and make a call. Great. Next key thing that you could do, you could actually say, well, hang on a second, I know that seller will sell if we find them something to buy. So what we're going to do is we're going to add them to our buyer-seller list. And what actually happens is that we read through the buyer-seller list every Tuesday to have a quick look at all the people that we know that if we find them something to buy, then naturally they will sell with us. So we start doing that, we start working through it. Then what we then do is we then send them on a Tuesday something we've got to call our buyer-seller email. Very different to everything else that goes out in the real estate industry. It's basically a summary of all of the new listings and a summary of all the properties that have been sold by any agency, any agent in that market over the course of the last 7 days. It's basically like the annual CMA report done in a weekly basis, and it's only sent to your buyer-sellers, not to everyone, just to the buyer-sellers. Then what we then do is that if we list a property or we sell a property, get on the phone, give them a quick call. Let's say, for example, we have a great auction and we have an underbidder. Then what we do is we pick up the phone, we ring them late on a Saturday afternoon. Hey, Hannah, I thought I'd give you a quick call. You wouldn't believe it. We actually just had a great underbidder at 12 Smith Street. They've missed out. I reckon that'd be perfect for your place. Is there any chance I can get them through? Then what we then do is that if you list a great property, you think it really does suit the requirements, you then jump on the phone and say, hey, Hannah, quick question. Could I just have an hour of your time to show you something on Thursday afternoon to see whether or not it might come close to suiting what it is that you're looking for? Then what we then do is we then start to have this whole conversation with them about what actually happens next, and we start really designing these customer experiences. So all of a sudden, you have a look at it. You got all these different things that you can do, and then you choose one of those, right? And that's actually what business is about taking the randomness out of the random acts of prospecting, of the random acts of how we're going to serve the customer. And instead, what we do is we actually define a process of a set of things that we can do that we actually then choose from the menu about what's right for that particular circumstance until we actually get in a position that we turn that market appraisal into a listing and then get into a position that it's a sold property. And that's the most important part of what you do inside a business, right? Is that you've got to start thinking differently around what you do, because what actually happens in a lot of businesses is that people collect market appraisals as though that's some sort of collector card when they were a kid. They just put them into the database and do nothing with them. And the interesting thing is that every single person who gets you out on a market appraisal, at some level, they've actually got some innate need, some sort of itch that needs to be scratched, some sort of idea, challenge, problem that they're actually trying to solve. So if you want to get good at this, the lesson is to think, what is the problem that this particular person is trying to solve by potentially buying, moving, selling? And if you can identify what the problem is around the buying, around the moving and or the selling, then that changes the entire way that you go and do the work. Because then you can be more interactive, more on it, more in the right place at exactly the right time, and you'll change the entire way that your business actually operates. So then what happens? So now when you go and train people, what you do is you work with the younger ones or the new people that are coming into the industry. You say, hey, quick question. We go out there, we do a market appraisal, then what happens? We send a letter of appraised value. Okay, great. Then what happens? We ring them to see if they want to sell. then what happens? I don't know. And that's exactly where the problem is, because everyone says they already know, but when you actually test and assess whether or not they actually know, what we find out is they don't actually know. And there's a great quote by Man Yang Wing where she says, to know and not to do is to not know at all. So now is the whole conversation, then what actually happens? Make sure that you're really clear on that. Make sure the people in your team can actually explain it. Because if you can't explain it and you can't define it, what chance is it that it's actually going to happen?